Hi, this is Isaac from Compositional IT. I recently tweeted an example of some charting over a dataset from FSharp, and it got a bit of interest, people asking how did I do it, what's the most effective ways of using FSharp with some data and so on. So I thought I'd do a quick video cast, which is here, that just takes you through the same process that I went through, hopefully a little bit more efficiently. And at the end of it, I'll also give you the GitHub repository link so that you can explore and experiment with the data yourself. Whilst obviously I'm going to be using a specific data set, it's more important that you learn and appreciate the different tools and techniques that I'm using, which are applicable against any data set. And I'm also interested in getting you to really look at how effectively and easily I can create a script and download packages from NuGet that can be easily used in FSharp, and how rapidly we can go from basically nothing to visualizing and working with some data. So the first thing we need to do is to download the dataset. Now in this case I'm actually just going to download a GitHub repository which contains all the data that we need. That's located here. As you can see, the repository is containing data for the coronavirus. Specifically, it contains data on infections by country on a daily basis. And we're going to try and use this to visualize that data over time. And you can see that I can copy the URL and then using Visual Studio Code's git clone feature, download the entire repository onto the local file system. So the first thing I want to do is just have a look at the data now that we've downloaded it inside Visual Studio Code. And there are actually quite a few nice extensions that make this a little bit less painful than it might otherwise be. So I'm going to open up the first CSV file in this folder. And as you can see here, this is a CSV file that's already colorized by columns. This is using the Rainbow CSV extension. There's also a second extension that we can use, which is called the Excel preview. And this gives us a more conventional sort of Excel style preview of our data with column headings for sorting and filtering. If we actually look at the data just a little bit, we can see that we have a number of columns, such as the province or state, the country, the last updated date time, and the number of confirmed deaths and recovered per data point, or per day in this case. So now I'm going to create an FSharp script, which I'm going to call scratchpad.fsx, where we're going to put our code in. And we're going to download, first of all, a NuGet package called FSharp data, which will allow us to easily interact with the CSV files. And to do that, I'm going to use the package manager, which comes with an excellent Visual Studio Code extension. So I can now call packet add NuGet package and type in fsharp.data, which will download the package. And now I'm going to use the generate load scripts command in packet. And this will generate an FSharp script file, which I can reference from my script. And that will automatically do all the hard work of referencing the actual NuGet packages. In this case, that's going to be FSharp core and FSharp data. So I'm going to start by loading that script in. As you can see, I'm getting IntelliSense suggestions from VS Code. That's using another extension, which I'll show you later. And I'm going to load in the main group FSX file. So now I should have access to fsharp.data. So I'm going to start by creating a type called COVID, which is going to store the contents, or rather the schema, of the data that we're going to be working with, and I can use the CSV provider in FSharp data to do that. So I'm going to get a path to one of the files and we'll use that as the schema. Now, one thing that you should be aware of is, although this looks like it compiles in the IDE, in FSI or FSharp Interactive in Visual Studio Code, this actually won't work because it's a relative path. So what we need to do is change that to a full path. Now I could put in my full path of my particular machine, but that obviously wouldn't be very useful for you if you decide to download this repository. So we can get around that by actually using a literal in FSI, or rather in the FSharp script, and we can use one of the sort of hidden features in FSharp scripts, which is the source directory macro. So that will get resolved when we execute the code, and by decorating that value with the literal attribute, I can replace the hard-coded path before. So this will work on anyone's machine. So now I'm going to execute the code that we've written so far, just to have a look at the data that's available in the file that we've linked above on line 6. So I can do that by just using the getSample method. And at this point I'm actually going to pin the interactive to the right so that we can look at the interactive and also code at the same time. So you can see we've got a few rows out, everything seems to be working. The only thing that's not to my liking here is the date is emitted in the interactive window in full, but we can actually fix this with another little trick, which is the FSI module, and there's a method on there called addPrinter, which lets you specify how to print out specific types. So for a date time, I'm just going to emit the short date time string. And if we run this again, we should now see that things are a little bit easier to read with the date on a single line. So the next thing to do is to read in all of the files and to combine all of the rows in all of them into a single data set. Now for this we can use standard .NET IO functionality. So we can use system IO directory get files to list all the files which end in CSV. And we can emit that to FSI so I can see immediately that it's working or not. Now what I next need to do is to convert those paths into full paths rather than relative ones. So I can use the seek map to map over all of those files and then use the path get full path method. Now that we have a list of all the file names, we need to pipe them into the COVID provider to get all of the actual data, all of the rows out of it. So there's a few ways you can do this. I'll show you a couple. The first one is going to be using just standard sequence pipeline functions. So for each file, we'd like to map it over the COVID load method, which will convert that file name into a type provider instance. And then for each instance, we want to get back the list of rows. Now you'll see now though that the result of this is actually a sequence of a sequence. This means that we're actually getting back for each file a list nested inside it. So to get around that, we can concatenate all of those lists into one. And now we indeed just get back a sequence of rows. The problem is though that the linter is telling us, well, we've done two maps one after another. You don't normally need to do that. So it's telling us to write it in a slightly more effective way. So you can do that by moving the COVID load into a particular value and then returning rows directly. We still get another lint though, which says if you do map and concat, you can actually replace this with collect. So that's one way of getting all of the rows into a single collection. But now let me show you an alternative way, which is to use list comprehensions. So I can say here for each file in files, load in the data for that file, and then give back the rows. Now again here you're going to see that we just get back a sequence of lists. So we can fix that by again using the sequence concat operator, or combinator I should say. But an alternative way, perhaps a little bit more elegant, is to use the yield command, which does the same thing. Now here we've got a list, but I'm actually going to replace that with a lazily evaluated sequence. This is a bit nicer to work with because particularly when you're doing scripts, if you're using lists or arrays, the entire data set will be emitted into the FSI window. I just want to see a few rows normally when I'm working with them. So you'll see now if I actually execute this, we don't get all of the rows emitted to the console. We just get the first 4 or 5. and that usually is just enough for us to see the results of our transformations. So now we're in a position where we've actually got our rows into one big collection. We can actually start to do some interesting analysis on it. So let's do something relatively simple, which is to group up all of the rows by the country and by the date and figure out over time the total number of cases for a given country. So just a reminder of what the data looks like again. We have the state, the country and the date for each row. So we essentially want to aggregate that all up by the date and the country. So in this example you can see we have a load of rows on this page for China, and we would want to group all of those up. Now I've tried a few different ways of doing this kind of nested grouping in a succinct and or efficient way. This is probably the best way that I've figured out how to do this so far in FSharp. If someone has a slightly nicer way of doing this, please do let me know. I'd be really interested to find out what your ideas are. So the way I do this is to use a sequence comprehension like we used above. And the first thing we're going to do is group up all of the data by country. So this will give us back a new sequence, which is a tuple of country and the rows in that country. So I want to iterate through all of that. So for all of the rows within this country, we'd like to group up those rows by the date and then get the total number of confirmed cases for that date. Also important is that for the last updated date, we just take the date component and not the date time, because you may have different update date times, but we'd want to group it up by the date itself. And now we want to aggregate all of the rows in that date by the total number or the sum of the number of confirmed cases. Once we have that, we're going to return back the country and the country data, which is effectively that grouping of date and confirmed. You'll see that we do get an error which says that nullable int doesn't support the plus operator. So that's totally fine. There are a couple of ways around this. One is to use the nullable support in .NET to go from a nullable to a regular value, a regular int, by providing a default, but it's not particularly idiomatic for FSharp. So we can actually change that by using a parameter in the CSV provider called prefer optionals, and that tells the type provider to render missing values as option types rather than nullable types, which means it fits a lot better with FSharp. So now that we have this as an option of int, we can use more standard FSharp collection operations. So in this case, I want to choose some values and then sum them. And now if we look at the IntelliSense, you'll see that we get back a sequence of strings, which are the country names, and then each sequence is the date time and int grouping underneath it. And if I now execute this code, you'll see in the FSI window that we get back a sequence of country and then a nested sequence of dates and numbers, where numbers is the sum of confirmed cases so far. Now that we've got our data into the shape we want it, let's visualize it. So to do that, I'm going to download another NuGet package, which is called xplotplotly, and we'll use the same technique that we used earlier. So the first thing I'd like to do with the Plotly library is to chart out the first country as a line graph onto the screen. We can see that the data is the dates and numbers where the country is mainland China. Let's pipe that into the chart line and then chart show methods. And there's our line chart. But let's go one step further and actually chart out the top 10 countries as 10 different series alongside one another. To do this, we'll sort the confirmed by country daily sequence based on the final number of confirmed on the last day for each country. So to do this, we can use the sort by descending method, and inside that we'll pick the final day and then the number of confirmed cases for that day. As you can see, China is the first result, and then Italy, South Korea and Iran. So let's take the first 10 and then just print out their names, their country names, to the console. And we can use the FST operator to do this a little bit more succinctly. Now notice that we've also got one entry in there called Others, which I actually don't want. I'd rather remove that. So I'm going to remove that right at the top of our all data collection. Now that we've done that, you can see that Others no longer feature and the UK is now propping up the 10th position. Now we need to show 10 different series rather than 10 different charts. So I'm going to look on the XPlot website and see how to do that. And you'll see there's a nice page called multiple chart types, and it gives us an example of how to do this using the scatter type. The main difference here is previously we were passing in a list of tuples, whereas here it wants each axis as a separate collection. So we need to somehow split out our single list into two lists. So I'm going to make a function called makeScatter, which will take in the country and all of the values for that country, essentially matching the signature of the top 10 value. But before I do this, we'll do it for just a single entry so that you can see how it works. The first thing I'm going to do is once again get the first row, which is mainland China and its data. And then we're going to look at the data. As you can see, it's a list of tuples of date, times and numbers. But what we want to get is two lists, one of each date, so the 22nd and the 23rd, and then another of numbers. Now we can use a handy feature in the array collection called unzip, which does exactly this. So now you can see that we have two lists back, or two arrays I should say. The first one are numbers and the second are dates. So let's apply this into our makeScatter function, which takes in the values, unzips them, and now is going to create a scatter where X is the dates and Y are the numbers. And we'll just upcast that into a trace. And now we can use this function and standard sequence map operators to go from each top 10 item into a scatter, and then map that into the chart.plot method and then show it. So there are our 10 series. Of course, in this case, we're just getting trace 0 to 9, which isn't so useful. So let's actually fix that. And the way we can do that is by actually getting a handle to the trace value rather than just returning it, and then setting the name property on it to the country, and then returning the trace. And as you can see now, we have the countries along with their names. Something I'd like to do is just temporarily remove China from the dataset so that we can analyze the other countries in a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to skip the first result so that we get actually results 2 to 11. So this is much more useful for us to analyze those values. We can also zoom in if we want to on the cluster on the bottom right and actually look in more detail at what's happening on a day-by-day basis. So that's about it really for this exploration. I hope it was useful, not really for the coronavirus analysis itself, but more to illustrate the ease at which we can use FSharp to work with data through Visual Studio Code, how you can use extensions to make your life a little bit easier, and how easy it is to download NuGet packages and interrogate them through FSharp scripts. You can get at the code that you've seen here, or a similar version of it at least, on our Compositional IT GitHub fork of the COVID-19 repo. I'll also just show you the extensions that I used. So for CSV parsing and display, I used Rainbow CSV and Excel Viewer. For FSharp, I used the FSharp Ionide plugin and the Ionide Packet plugin as well, which has recently been enhanced to also work with Packet global and local tools. The last extension that I used as well was the Path IntelliSense extension, which gives you IntelliSense when you are typing in file paths. The only other two real dependencies you'll need is the .NET Core framework itself. So you can get that on .NET-Microsoft.com/download for Windows, Linux or Mac. And you can also get Visual Studio Code on codevisualstudio.com, and that's also for Mac, Windows or Linux. That's about it then. I hope you enjoyed this and found it useful, and I'm looking forward to seeing your feedback and ideas in the comment section of this video. Have fun and take care.